Rajesh, can you hear my voice?
Yeah, I can hear.
Yeah.
Hi
What about
Rajesh,
mine? Hi, Aziz. How are
how are
you?
you? Good.
Good.
Ben is also here.
Hi, Abdul, where are you? I mean, are you from?
Yeah, I am Groningen.
Oh, okay. I
How are
thought
you,
you.
Dibendu?
That's fine. I thought you might have come India.
No. I will be
Good
coming to India in
morning,
September.
everyone. Suresh Agarwal
Okay.
this side.
Hi
Hi, sir.
Suresh,
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, Suresh.
Matthew, how are you?
I was fine. I mean,
We have
I
not met for
can.
long.
No, we met a couple of days back, when there was an event in
Few weeks
BSc.
back.
Yeah.
Uh, Chalo, everything good.
Well, I'm making an event to invite you. So I'll talk to you separately.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Veena, shall I start?
Yes, please.
It's already 3:30.
Yes, we can start it.
Um, so good afternoon, everyone. This is a part of a research seminar presentation today by Dr. Abdul Rahman. It is a research seminar series in ISID has been we are conducting the research seminar for almost 3 years now. And the main purpose is to reach out to especially the young researchers who are at the early stage of research, and they should be get benefited from this from some eminent speakers, and they're listening to the discussions and all. So today's seminar is by Abdul Iramban from Groningen University. We are very privileged to have Abdul here. Welcome, Abdul, to ISIT Research Seminar. Abdul, I must say he is a very distinguished researcher, and he has been working in productivity area for quite some time with very important personalities like Professor Golder, Professor Kel Krishna, and so on. So I'll just introduce him very quickly. Professor Aramban is teaching at University of Groningen, and this paper is, I think, it is with the Max Planck Institute, which is in Manchester. With its institute support, I think he wrote this paper. This is a very well written paper, and as usual, Abdul is very much comprehensive in his work and very descriptive and very thorough. No doubt about it. We all know. And he is expertise in economic growth and development of measurement, analysis of productivity and technological change, structural change, digital transformation, ICT, and intangibles of growth and productivity, globalization, global value chains, and so on. He has held many various important positions like senior fellow in the conference board, external researcher. He worked extensively with the India claims supported by the Reserve Bank of India, consultant researcher also at International Labour Organization, which is ILO, and consultant researcher also at World Bank. Today he will be speaking on productivity and policies in post-independence India from planning to liberalization. This is actually a paper which here he seeks to provide us with a historical account of productivity enhancing in post-independence India, which he followed the Van Ark typology, and then he linked them to observed productivity trends, which provides a systematic historical overview of productivity policies and productivity
मेरे को
trends in
पूछना
India
भूल गया
since
इसका क्या हाल है
1950. Sorry.
Please continue.
So, an overview of historical trends in productivity and structural change in the post-independence Indian economy. He reviewed various productivity policies in India and discusses some key productivity policy changes at the end. The final section concludes. He concludes with the guidance on some future policies. Now, Aramban, you have with you 30 minutes to present. And we have three panelists, distinguished panelists, who will be discussing your paper. First is Professor Arup Mitra, who needs no introduction. He was supposed to join, but at the last moment, he had some emergency. So he had shared with us his comments, which Bina, our convener, will read at the last. The other two panelists are first is Dibendu Maiti, who is a friend of mine also and a very good association with this school. He is in this school and previously he was at IEG and he had held many important positions and he's with several committees and he has in with him various publications which are at quite top journals. We are very much privileged to have Dibendu with us for discussing your paper. And last is Rijesh, who is my colleague at ISID. He is assistant professor here and he also works extensively with productivity. And without wasting any time, I request Iraman to start your presentation now. You can have 10 minutes more because Professor Mitra is not here. And so as panelists, Dibendu and Rijesh can take according to their choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Moha, for that introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it is visible. Just make it a full screen.
Is it good now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being here today. And to ISID, Bina, and Moha for supporting this paper and giving me this opportunity to speak today. And again, thank you, Moha, for that introduction. I want just a small correction in that. It's not Max Planck Institute, but it is the Productivity Institute of the Manchester University. That is.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, absolutely no problem. I just wanted to make sure. And I'm quite glad that people with great experience on productivity and policy, like Arup, Dibendu, and Rijesh are in the panel. And I must also say that this work has greatly benefited from my own long association working on India's productivity. And in particular, as Moha already said, my association with Professor Goldar, K.L. Krishna, Suresh, and our late colleague Dev Kushumdas. And while working on this paper, I also had to reread many of the policy evaluation papers written in the past again, including the works of Nagesh Kumar and others. This paper, as Moa rightly said, was started as a project funded by the Productivity Institute as a chapter in an upcoming book on lessons from productivity policies around the world, which is coming next year. And I was given 15 pages, including tables, charts, and text to write this paper. As you already know, economic policies in India are widely written about. I mean, particularly those of the 1980s and 1990s, Even books have been written about it. So this was a kind of two-edged sword for me, because first it made easy to take a stock of all the various policies, definitely. But it also made it quite hard to condense and concise it into 15 pages. And that was a very Herculean job. And the working paper version, which is available right now on the website, is a little longer, but the final paper is even shorter and more condensed. So I must warn you that there is nothing extraordinary new in this paper, but the objective here is to provide a bird's eye view of several policies over the years, but organized under broad categories or typology, policy typology, which Bart van Ark and others uh, developed 2 years ago, along with the trends in productivity during those different policy regimes. The discussion is not very comprehensive in the sense that the policies which are covered here may still be missing many. But with this typology, what are the type of policies that fits into the typology? And that is what I will be basically looking into. And there is no causal analysis in this. Basically, it's like descriptive of policies. Now, the typology of productivity policies. See, you can still see my screen, full screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Okay,
yes, you could.
great. The typology of policies is a framework developed by Bart van Ark and others. I will first discuss the typology very briefly. This comes from this paper by Bart van Ark, Dirk Pellet, and Klaas de Vries. Then I will show a few charts that basically depicts the whole evolution of India's productivity since post-independence over the last 75 years. Then I will summarize major policies and policy character of different phases during the last 75 years using the typology. Basically, following the standard practice in Indian literature, I divide the policy phases into pre-1980s, 1980s, partial liberal reforms period of the 1980s, the pro-market reforms of the 1990s, and the post-2000 continuation of the policies in the post-2000 period. I also have to tell you that while I tried to adapt the typology developed by Bart van Ark and others into Indian context, it was not completely possible to attribute a specific policy into particular typology. Rather, I had to identify policies. Some policies fall into different categories of policy typologies, and some are does not fit into any of those. So I have tried to do my best in attributing different policies into different typologies. But again, as I said earlier, while linking productivity to policies, I do not make any causal or econometric analysis. Now, a final remark I have is that all the analysis that I use in this are based on 2011-2012 series of data. We all know that India has released a new series of data which provides substantially different picture, especially about manufacturing sector, where we see manufacturing sector is growing much faster, while one of my conclusion, which you will listen earlier, later today, is that of story of a weak manufacturing. And also, I'm not going to motivate my presentation today highlighting the importance of productivity. I'm taking it for granted that everyone in this audience are aware of the importance of productivity for economic development. Now, let me introduce you to this typology of productivity policies. First of all, aggregate productivity growth, which is definitely important for economic development, welfare, and competitiveness, and so on. So the conceptual framework is basically divides the policies into broadly three type of categories. The first is a direct set of policies. These are policies that basically intends to improve productivity through factor accumulation by investing in physical capital, human capital, natural resource policies or infrastructure policies, and so on. And technology or structural change, which basically improving productivity and also improving improving worker movement from resource movement from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors and so on. Then the second set of policies are indirect policies. So you see that the first set of policies are directly increasing productivity on the right and left side of the framework here. And the indirect policies are policies that influence productivity by changing the market and resource allocation. So that includes all the trade internationalization policies, financial sector reforms, and things like that. And third is the foundational policies, which have bearing on all those other policies. They are like institutional changes, regulatory and macroeconomic reforms, and so on. I will not touch a lot on that, foundational policies in this presentation. But also we have to be remembering that while these policies, typologies may appear to be distinct and they are presented to be distinct policies, they are complementary. They can be reinforcing each other and they are interconnected. So that aspect is also there actually. So this is the basic typology I will try to follow in this. Now I will show you a few charts that explains the productivity trends in Indian economy during the last 75 years. So this is one summary picture of productivity and economic growth in India since 1950, since independence till 2024. So this is the evolution of GDP growth. So all the numbers which you see that in the circle here is the GDP growth during that time phase, 1950 to 1980, 1980 to so this is a different reform phases, 1980s, 1990s, and the 2000s. I have subgrouped, divided into a few categorization here, basically because we had the financial crisis in 2008, and then we had the COVID pandemic in the early 2000s. So I divided this to show you how those periods are actually working around here. So the orange bar here is the labor productivity growth averaged over that time horizon, and the green bar is the employment growth. So these two, when you're calculating in log changes, these two add up to the GDP growth rate in the economy. So the two lines below are basically, the dotted line is the average labor productivity indices, basically based to the index to the 1950, and the GDP growth is the solid line here. So what you see here is that if you look at that solid line, GDP in India grew more than 35 to nearly 40 times since independence, and labor productivity nearly 9 times over that significant longer time period. But that came from multiple episodes of growth and, very importantly, shifting roles of productivity and employment growth. So you see that the growth rates in the circle, that is quite different in different time periods, but also the composition of growth, the orange and green bars are different across a time period. So as we all know, the early phases were the typical what we call the protectionist state public sector license Raj regimes of 1980s, during which we had the so-called Hindu growth of 3.5% GDP growth in Indian economy, which was very slow, sluggish growth period. But the interesting part there is actually the relative importance of employment growth and productivity growth was quite similar during that phase. It was like 1.7% of productivity growth and 1.7% of labor productivity growth. Then, since the 1980s, when we started partially liberalizing our economy, we see an acceleration in productivity growth, that the orange bar is significantly expanding. While the employment growth also improved in the 1980s, it's went back to its original, 1.7% growth rates in the 1990s when we had the full set of liberalization, but productivity still continued to grow. And in the subsequent period, employment growth has decelerated. I mean, not decelerated, but it has declined, while the productivity growth remains substantially high. So the productivity growth, which is the orange segment, became more important in the subsequent period in the Indian economy. So, for example, in the 1980s, almost 60% of India's GDP growth came from improvement in output per worker growth rate. 3 out of for that 5% growth came from that. In the 1990s, subsequent increase in productivity, which increased to about 3.1% slowly, even when the growth declined slightly to 4.9%. Again, that constituted about 65% of the GDP growth. And in the early 2000s, substantial improvement in productivity. As you can see, that significant improvement, almost 90% of growth came from labor productivity growth. And in the further period, that acceleration of productivity sustained in the economy until the COVID pandemic hit the economy to negative productivity growth, and then the post-COVID revival in employment has led to significant acceleration in employment growth and decline in productivity growth. But overall, the picture is that of the aggregate economy labor productivity growth accelerated substantially since the 1990s liberalization. That became the dominant driver of India's economic growth. Now, the question is that this aggregate picture is concealing many dynamics within different industries and across industries. I will not go to that industry level picture here. I do have that chart in my paper, but what I can tell you is that the picture that comes out of that industry productivity growth is that of a notable difference in productivity growth across sectors and over phases. Was there somebody asking something? Okay. Now, in this picture, I look at the sectoral composition of productivity and jobs together in terms of intersectoral movement of workers and how much that contributed to that aggregate productivity growth we obtained in the Indian economy over the period. So aggregate productivity growth can be achieved either by improving productivity in each of the individual sectors or by moving resources, particularly employment in this case, to better performing, better productivity sectors. So the green bar here is the within sector productivity. So how much of the aggregate productivity growth is coming from improvement within each and every sector, within manufacturing, agriculture, construction, and so on. And the gray bar is showing you how much of that is coming from intersectoral movement of workers in the economy. So again, what we see here is that in the pre-1980s, it was a period where public sector was dominated in the production across all the segments of the economy. Worker reallocation was very poor. Actually, it basically indicates that workers were moving into the sectors which were least productive in the economy or less productive in the economy, thus contributing negatively to aggregate economy is productivity growth. So basically, growth reducing structural change in the pre-1980s period. That is what we see here. Actually, if I assume that there was no worker movement at all in the economy because the structure of the economy remained unchanged in the economy, that would have improved productivity growth by almost 45% higher. So that kind of negative structural change what we had in the pre-1980 period. But since 1980s, what we see is that there is a significant shift in this trend. We see workers are moving increasingly to, jobs are expanding increasingly in more productive sectors. And this has been consistently the pattern in the post-1980s period, but more so in the 2000s, which often we call as the golden period of India's productivity growth. So especially during 2003, 2007, and even during the post-crisis 2008, 2018 decade, we see significantly large amount of structural transformation contributing to productivity growth in India. And of course, in the post-pandemic period, which is a short period in this time, in this analysis, we see a decline in the structural change component, again, because of some of the issues, external shock issues, which is related to that. So I'm not worrying much about that part, but actually the story here, or the bottom line here is that structural transformation has been growth enhancing in general, although its relative importance has changed after the post-reform periods in India. Now, This is so we talked about labor productivity growth has been improving, and labor productivity growth has been coming from both within sector productivity growth and structural change in the economy. But the question is that we have also seen the employment growth has not been, especially in the first 2000s, it has not been improving significantly and so on. So where is that productivity stimulus coming from? That productivity, so here I am decomposing that aggregate economy labor productivity growth into standard growth accounting, TFP kind of and factor accumulation. So this is the factor accumulation and total factor productivity component of our policy typology. First of all, what we see here is that in the pre-1980s, there was no TFP at all. TFP growth in the economy was nearly zero. So there was everything which we have seen, all the labor productivity growth, which we have seen came from factor accumulation and primarily capital accumulation. But barring the decline during the transitional phase of 1990s, 1990 to 2002 period, and the post-COVID period of 2019, 2024, TFP growth in the economy has been generally positive. So we see that the TFP became important in the economy, and that became even more dominantly important in the 2000s until from 2003 to 2008 period in the economy. That's the most important thing. But now capital accumulation, which is the orange and yellow bars here. Orange is the non-ICT capital, and yellow is the ICT capital. That has played the most important role in accelerating labor productivity growth in Indian economy. So basically, the amount of capital with which workers were working, that has significantly increased in the Indian economy, and this has been the case throughout all the policy phases, even during the slowdown period, in the growth slowdown period, productivity growth stagnation, or TOP, even when TOP declined or GDP growth declined, in all the periods, capital has been the main driver of economic growth, labor productivity growth in Indian economy. So the bottom line here is that long-term productivity growth in India was deeply tied to capital accumulation, and that is primarily coming from private investment, and that is what I'm going to show in the next chart, where you see that the evolution of India's investment pattern. Investment to GDP ratio on the left-hand side in the total economy has consistently increased from 1950 till 2006, 2007 period, which is the peak investment rate in India, which is about 40% of GDP. But the interesting pattern here is again the structural shift in the investment pattern, that in the earliest phase until I have here since 1960 till 1980s, you can see that public sector investment has been significantly present in the Indian economy, but that presence has declined radically since the mid 1980s, where the private investment has taken off significantly. And this acceleration in capital accumulation that is contributing to productivity growth in India has been primarily driven by private capital accumulation in India. This is also true with manufacturing sector, as you can see on the right hand side. I see that I am already 11:26 now, but let me try to wrap up this discussion of the trends in productivity. And this is my final chart where I disaggregated the aggregate total factor productivity growth, which we have seen here in the green bar here, into different contribution of different industries. So I divide Indian economy into 5 different sectors: agriculture, which is the green component here; all other industries like mining, construction, electricity generation, water sanitation, and so on; all the manufacturing sector, which is the gray line bar; and the market services, which is all the services except public administration, health, education, and real estate services, and that is the yellow one; and the non-market services, which is the blue one. Very interesting dynamics we find here is that, first of all, recall that we saw TFP growth revival in the 1980s, as I said earlier. In the pre-1980s, we did not have any TFP growth. So in the 1980s, we had TFP revival. And that revival, as you can see here, is primarily coming from the blue bar here, which is the non-market services. So the government sector, the health sector, health services, and so on, all these were the sector that was primarily driving the 1980s revival in TFP growth in the Indian economy, although agriculture and market services were also registering a positive product GOP growth. The primary driver was in non-market services. The second point here is that the industrial sector, the manufacturing and the mining and all the other sectors were actually seeing negative GOP growth during that period. The second thing is that in the 1990s, manufacturing still continued to have negative GOP growth, but there was a service sector continued to be the driver of productivity growth, but there is a shift. So this structural shift has been, an important. So from public sector to the private sector, and from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors, as we saw earlier, and now we see this sectoral shift in total factor productivity from non-market services to market services. So market services like trade, business services, retail services, telecommunication, transport services, and so on. These were the service sectors that was driving total factor productivity growth in the 1990s. And that continues to be the case in 2000s, during which agriculture also improved productivity. But the important thing to notice here in the post-2000 period is that manufacturing sector also have seen a revival in TFP growth. But post-crisis period, the decline, the reduction in the aggregate TFP growth was driven by, again, market services. So the point is that post-90 period, the fluctuations or the dynamics in the GFP growth in India was primarily driven by market services. See, in the 2008-18 period, the improvement in productivity has been primarily driven by non-market services. Again, a shift back to non-market services. And then in the post-2019 COVID period, you see substantial decline in TFP, which is a broad-based decline in TFP. A final point I would make here is that TFP growth in general in India has been uneven. I don't have the picture of detailed 27 clumps industries here, but if you look at the clumps industries, that you can see that the industry growth, productivity growth has been very uneven. There were some sectors which are growing faster, some sectors which are growing slower, and so on, except during 2003-2007 period, during which most of the sectors have shown better productivity performance in the Indian economy. So now I will go to a kind of a summary slide. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I'm going to rather skip this. But this slide is basically summarizing the evolution of policy into growth phases with all the trends which I have shown you earlier. But it's basically the story which I told you, but it's a summary of all the stories. So in the early development phase, we have all the growth came from, intensive factor accumulation, while not GFP at all. While in the beginning of early phases of reforms, we have seen some productivity improvement, but again, that was concentrated in some sectors of the economy. While in the 1990s, during the early reforms consolidation phases, we have seen some TFP moderation. But in 2000s, post-crisis, post-reform phase, we have seen substantial TFP gains, but mostly driven by service sector TFP growth. Now, let me try to present you these different policies. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them because, again, I don't have time. But rather, I would basically focus on some of the main insight of each policy in each of these periods. So here, four different phases of policies for factor accumulation. So what happened is that with all these policies, you can see that on the screen, right? I mean, we had import substitution in the previous regime, heavy industry focus, license charge, higher education focused on IIMs and IITs, infrastructure policies, and so on. So many policies. So what basically happened is that some infrastructure gains that we accumulated in the pre-1980s but that resulted very weak human capital development, and especially education was concentrated on higher education. So mass-based educational gains were not there, and there were nearly no private investment happening in the economy. So growth was heavily capital intensive, but not broad-based. It was coming primarily from a few industries and government sector, and there was no massive education program in terms of factor accumulation here. Now, in the 1980s, reforms were basically favoring large and incumbent firms. They were accumulating capital. Small businesses and new entrants were not able to invest and not able to contribute to the aggregate economy's capital accumulation. So, partly capital accumulation improved, but without a kind of broad-based productivity takeoff from that coming from it. So the productivity gains were confined to mostly, again, non-market sector. In the 1990s, broad reforms were basically enabling private sector significantly. Capital accumulation, as I showed you earlier, with all the dismantling of license charge, foreign direct investment was liberalized, exchange rate and fiscal stabilization happened. There was reforms in the infrastructure and power sector reforms. I discuss all these in detail in the paper. So that really helped improve capital accumulation in the economy. And finally, in the 2000s and continuing policies today, that went beyond, these policies only, but they also went to more of, foundational groundwork. So the long-term gains will really depend upon how these policies are implemented. So now going to technology and structural change policies. So the pre-1980s were again aimed at self-reliance and technological stagnation, and efficiency was stifled because of that import substitution for FDI and state control of research and development. There was some positive development like our green revolution and agriculture modernization and so on, but effectively these were not policies that really empowered technological change and structural change. We have seen the impact of that in the data. In the 1980s, there was a little bit more tech-driven economy. New computer policies were introduced. There was some licensing relaxation and so on. So, but still, protection continued in the economy and so on. So it was more of a cautious and selective reforms in terms of technology and structural change policies. So that still started the base for India's IT boom that would come later, and still the reform lacked scale and inclusiveness of all the firms in the economy. In the 1990s, the massive liberalization policies that created potential for structural change, science and technology and innovation policy have improved potential for technology, and so on, making. I think there is a mistake in this table. I'm sorry about it, but basically the policies in that created a lot of technology intensive sectors. And in 2000s, but again, we have continued those national highway policy infrastructure, science and technology, Startup India, Digital India, Make in India, all those policies that created a more innovation-driven, inclusive, foundational policies into also trying to embed more into global value chain. But at the same time, there has been some policies which were moving away from India's openness to foreign trade and so on, like self-reliance and Atmanirbhar Bharat and so on. So those were policies that was slightly taking the one step behind, to backward in terms of technology and structural change. So there was also a lot of market and resource allocation policies. Again, I'm not going through all of them. I mean, a lot of policies here, but in the 1980s, there was overcrowding of market policies by bureaucracy, a lot of bureaucracy, and all these license charge and all those requirements that distorted the resource allocation in the economy. In the 80s, we have seen more market freedom introduced, but again, this resource allocation was heavily focusing on heavy industries and influenced by state industries and so on. Some early deregulations in the market that benefited primarily the incumbents, but still markets were tightly managed by the government, and bureaucracy still existed in the economy, which basically again continued to distort resource allocation and the productivity gain. In the 1990s, markets liberalized more, and in the 2000s, we have been creating more institutional base for competitive market in the economy. A lot of policies, good GST, insolvency and bankruptcy code, labor law reforms, which is, I mean, some of them still, the impact of it is yet to come in terms of how successfully we are implementing it. And finally, the trade and FDI policies, again, 1980s were completely, protectionist policy. So we did not open our economy to foreign investments. And in the 1980s and some improvement happened, but in the 1990s we had more open trade policies. And finally, in 2000s, we still continued that FDI and trade policies here. So with that policy landscape over the last 70 years, the question is whether they were pro or anti-productivity. The pre-1980s, definitely that was not a recipe for productivity. We had a socialist, protectionist stagnation and productivity stagnation. In the 1980s, which we have opened up to a little bit more into productivity, but 1990s were more oriented towards productivity oriented policies, and that has been continuing in the subsequent period. Now, on the right hand side, I have this, what really happened in terms of those different phases from 1980 to 2014, 24 in India. GDP, as I said earlier, increased from 2.9 so in 1980. So this is 1950 is one. So 3 times in 1980, but 34 times by 2024. But you also see that during the same phase, China's GDP has increased 240 times in the same phase. And how did China manage to do that? That was basically, I told you earlier, India's growth was heavily capital driven. But you see that India's capital deepening has increased 18 times over the 2024 to 1950 period, 75 years, while China's capital deepening increased 290 times during the same phase. And China also have increased TFP by 3.5 times, while India has 1.4 times. So overall, the per capita GDP in India increased by 9 times, while China has increased by 93 times. So this is the kind of dynamics which we have seen. So India, even though we have been accumulating capital per worker, we have seen relatively better improvement in employment growth compared to China, but our productivity growth has been weak, primarily because both TFP and the translation of capital accumulation into TFP and the magnitude of capital accumulation compared to, for example, China has been weak. And this is primarily because we have been having a weak manufacturing sector in India. So I'm going to skip this slide, because this is a slide where I basically discuss different policy phases, what policies worked and what did not work. But that is pretty clear now. And at the interest of time, that basically comes to what were the main challenges for India's productivity growth going forward. To go to that, I would summarize the basic characterization of India's productivity growth. Basically, they were, as we have seen, it was service-led productivity growth in India. Services accounted for most of the productivity gain in the post-1990 period. And we already know that, the software services, business services, these have been important drivers of productivity, telecom services, and so on, for which earlier investment in, elite education system might have contributed by providing, highly qualified, skilled workers in IT sector and so on. But it also created a lot of spin-off effect in terms of other sectors that were relying on IT and telecommunication services, including retail services, have benefited, creating more informal and less skilled jobs in the economy. And the structural transformation has featured a lack of industrialization. I know that. I mean, that's why I'm not sure whether Goldar is here, but Goldar may disagree with me on this point, because Goldar has been recently writing about manufacturing has been driving India's growth. I am still not completely sure about that argument. We can discuss it, of course, later if that comes up. But my feeling is that India's structural transformation has featured a transformation from agriculture to services, including construction sector, and of low scale, low value added service jobs in the economy. So without any full scale industrialization. So that has been one reason why the magnitude of capital deepening in India and also the magnitude of translation of capital deepening to TOP has been slower in India. So basically, we still need, at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that multiple policies have been very important and they have been playing an important role in explaining the trends in the labor productivity, what we have seen so far through accumulation of capital, labor quality, structural change, and TOP in the economy. So my point on the weak manufacturing sector, let me substantiate that. Manufacturing employment. So I think in the recent, if you look at the share of value added in manufacturing, it increased from 12.7% in 1950 to 14.3% in 2022 in India. I think the latest, more recent revision of national accounts would say that it increased to 14.7% in terms of nominal value added. And employment increased from 8.2 to 10.6%. This is still substantially lower if you compare with any advanced economies during their development phase, even if you compare with China, for example. Now, one argument is that if you do the constant price adjustment, it will show improvement. Definitely, it does show improvement. That has to do with the base year. So it's basically when you are using the constant prices, you are basically looking at the structure of the economy if prices were fixed at the base year, right? So that if you do that, definitely India's manufacturing value added share improves, but still it doesn't create employment. So, but even if you do that, if you look at China's transformation, for example, now, see the red bold line here, solid line here is the constant price manufacturing share in value added in China compared to India, for example. So these see the magnitude of increase that. So it speaks about the relative price decline in manufacturing compared to services. And that is primarily the reason why you see that. Even if you take that standard from a global comparison perspective, I think India's manufacturing has still not been substantially high in terms of contributing to the economy's GDP. So as number of factors have contributed to that weaknesses, including soft and hard infrastructure, regulatory burdens, and labor market rigidities. And many in the early phases, we had significant constraints on achieving scale and so on. A lot of stories have been already discussed about, and particularly small and medium scale enterprises are facing significant constraints, technology adoption barrier, infrastructure bottlenecks, and so on. And so even in a recent paper, where Goldar, Suresh, and we have seen how even a simple use of information and access to IT, how it enables informal sector productivity improvement, for example. So there has been significant constraints in the manufacturing sector that has reduced takeoff of manufacturing sector. A second challenge which we have identified in this paper for India's challenges to productivity growth and structural change is the persistence of informality. More than 80% of India's workforce is still in informal sector, with their output contribution is substantially low, which basically means that their labor productivity is significantly lower than formal sector. According to the NSO's unincorporated and incorporated survey, manufacturing jobs are 50% of manufacturing jobs, and 10% of value added is coming from informal sector. 60% of jobs in trade and 20% of value added, and 1/3 of jobs and 7% of value added in other service sector is coming from that. So despite several policy initiatives, especially during the last policy phase, the labor code consolidation, all those policies aim to include financially and digitally, like GST, Aadhaar, Jantan, and all these policies. Still, the pace of formalization of Indian economy is substantially lower, especially when you compare with the peer countries like Vietnam or Cambodia and other countries. And the third constraint is the human capital and innovation constraint. Of course, we already know that in the recent years, educational policies have been attempting to become more and more broad-based, but still there is substantial gap in quality, spatial and social, exclusion and gap in quality of education, and weak academia and industry collaboration in India, which is widely discussed in the literature. And finally, this all feeds into the poor research and development spending in India, which is about 0.6% of GDP in 2020, which is as same as 1996 in India, which is much lower than peer countries like China or advanced economies like Germany or United States in India. So these are important challenges for India, and I think I'm coming to the end of it. So I'm little over my time. I'm sorry about it, Moa. But the road forward is inclusive human capital, focusing on innovation, and not just trying to formalize the informal sector, but try to helping the informal sector to modernize and improve their production and help them to engage more and more in the global value chain and also the domestic value chain, and also embedding the technology and sustainability at the core of development strategy. Basically, what I mean is that manufacturing technology and service sector technology is changing so rapidly. Artificial intelligence, for example, is presenting both opportunity and uncertainty. It could challenge many routine jobs, many even the call center jobs and kind of jobs in the economy. So if we do not make our population and our economy ready, both in terms of using and employing those skills in the economy, that is very important. Climate change is an important challenge for India that also highlights the importance of understanding the relevance of green investment and so on. And finally, focusing more on manufacturing, but at the same time continuing the importance of service expansion, because service will definitely continue to provide an edge for India in participating global value chain and keeping its competitiveness in the international economy. So with that, I will stop my presentation with this chart on the screen, basically because we have the objective and the aspiration of becoming a developed economy by 2047. This chart is basically showing the evolution of per capita GDP in India and China at the bottom, where India was above China relative to the United States in the 1950s. China overtook India in the mid-1990s and substantially increased over India, significantly widening the gap. Now, even if India wants to achieve the per capita income of the lowest per capita income among advanced economies, which is Greece, it would require about 6.4% per capita income growth, sustained per capita income growth in the next coming years. So to achieve that, we definitely need to have better and more rapid productivity growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Iramban. It was actually a very excellent presentation, and actually, we all expect good presentations from you. It's such a heavy work you have done. So, congratulations. Now, I invite Dibyendu if you can start.
No. I'm asked Rajesh to present because I don't have much to say. Let's Rajesh make the comment.
Okay.
And
Rajesh, may I request Rajesh? That is
Yeah.
Rajesh.
Okay. I
Rajesh.
thought I will come at the end, but
No, Dibyendu requested you to say first.
okay. So, thank you, Mahua.
Mm.
And
Rajesh, do you want me to stop presenting my slide? I'm not able to do that somehow.
you can stop it if you.
It's not visible.
It's not visible now.
It's not visible.
Okay. Good.
It's not visible. Yeah, that's fine. So, thank you, Dr. Aziz. It was always wonderful to hear you. The detailed, not only the productivity trends, but it's related. It's the very extensive discussion about the policy. Although, because of the time constraint, it was not discussed in detail. But in the paper, it was very heavily covered of the different phases of policy changes and how it has impacted. So basically, the main argument of the paper is that it's a kind of a historical synthesis of linking the productivity trends with the policy changes and how these are actually related, and how the productivity trajectory has actually been influenced by different policy regime. And he has used some typology to make his argument, and he tried to basically categorize these different policies, and major emphasis was given to basically factor accumulation, three components, basically factor accumulation, structural change, and then the market allocation mechanism. So in that, he tried to combine different aspects into this framework. So it's a very substantial work, and I think the students who are very interested in this should read this working paper. It will be very useful. So I have some few comments for the discussion and all. So in the beginning itself, he has mentioned that this is basically a kind of a descriptive study, and it's a kind of interpretive survey. Yeah. So I would like more like kind of an, more explicit identification strategies. I'm using some causal analysis that would be further enrich this discussion, because, the productivity change can also happen because of some external factors, global changes in technology, or it can happen because of the trade policy dynamics at the global level also. So if you have more of a systematic analysis using some, econometric kind of thing, that would further enrich this discussion. And since this study is basically about the policy, policy changes, I think the discussion about the political economy of the policy regime, that would also be much helpful. Because at a certain point, different policies were taken, and why it was done. That what was the political economy behind these changes, and then certain sectors were opened up, but not all. So, what were really the political economy behind all these aspects would be very much useful. Then Aziz has actually categorized the policies into pro productivity and anti productivity. I think it was a bit of a kind of oversimplifying, it seems to me, because this productivity change itself, it's like it's a time is there. Time productivity changes only happens after a certain lag is always there, and it's also it depends upon the sectors. So sector specific aspect is also there. So in that context, it is not very like easy to say that certain policies are very pro or anti. For example, if you look at the import substitution policies regime that India had, of course, in the short run, and there is a quite extensive literature on the inefficiencies that is created by this continued pursuit of import substitution and all. But we can also argue that it also created a certain kind of learning and capability building for certain industries. Because of the protection and all, they also try to learn from the production capability has been there. So in that sense, it is the real effect of the policy can also be seen in terms of a long run kind of thing. So productivity change, not only the effects are visible at the short run, but that policy's main reward in terms of building the technological capability, the learning mechanism in the manufacturing sector, that happen after a long time. So when the economy was liberalized, the fruits of this learning mechanism was actually being realized in a later period of time. So in that sense, how we can actually club them as a pro or anti kind of productivity policy, I am not very much sure. And then it is argued that the capital accumulation is basically the productivity story of Indian manufacturing is basically capital accumulation. So it's basically an input-driven kind of thing. So in that case, it becomes a policy concern that no, maybe the productivity is not basically sustainable in the long run. So unless it is an innovation kind of driven policy, if it is mainly the input driven accumulation, then there is a chance that we will fall back to the diminishing returns and all. So it is better to have kind of more importance to the innovation thing. And yeah. So then there was a discussion on the informality in the manufacturing sector, which is always been discussed, and it is considered as a drag to the productivity of the formal manufacturing. But another way of looking at it is like informality is also the result of the policy itself. Certain policies created, for example, the rigid labor laws itself has created certain informality. The firms, it's naturally the response of the firm to go for this kind of informal setup because of the rigid laws that were there. So in that sense, it is also kind of a result of the policy itself. And finally, I was thinking of giving more emphasis on the theoretical aspects, some literature on the liberalization, how it can improve the productivity. There are channels of theoretical channels are there, like competition, reallocation, and all. But what are the channels which is applicable in the kind of protective regime? Whether that is always a kind of productivity growth retarding kind of thing, or is there any chance, as I mentioned earlier, the import substitution can also be think of capability building kind of thing. So whether that can be incorporated into this thing. And then you have mentioned about Golder's sir paper, and I think in 2022 he has published a paper where he argued that in the 1990s is basically if you adjust for the mismeasurement of inputs and other factors, the productivity growth has been considerably higher. So in that case, what would be your response to that? So these are some of my comments for this, but otherwise it's a very, very comprehensive paper, and it's a very useful for all the students and other people who are interested in this research. So I will stop here. So thank you.
Thank you, Rijesh. Now, can I request Tibindu?
Before Dibyendu start, I just one point, because Dibyendu will have, I'm pretty sure, will also have an opinion about what Rijesh just told about, right? Because informality itself is a result of rigidities in the labor market, I'm pretty sure. So it would be nice to hear that too.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let me first thank Abdul for excellent presentation. I did not go through the paper line by line, but I have glanced through. So I like the paper definitely to understand. If one would like to understand the Indian economic transitions, I think this paper should be definitely good enough to at least get a glimpse of that. No, see, I have been actually talking to you, for a long time on the issues of the informality. So today I have decided not to talk about informality. We'll talk maybe on individual discussions on something else. So paper is quite interesting, and actually a couple of interesting results has been highlighted. I think that I also to some extent liked. So the thing is that in spite of the fact that the Indian economy has actually grown, it hasn't been really driven by the productivity good, and that is basically a tragedy. I mean, although at the end, Abdul concluded that if you want to really achieve the growth of a Greece economy, and the productivity growth has to be driver, but although productivity growth has increased, maybe from 90 onwards after liberalization. But this hasn't been actually promoted manufacturing growth. So this is one, because manufacturing was supposed to be the main driver, because anyone who would actually expect for economic transitions, so the agricultural sector, labor should actually, or labor and resource should actually move from agricultural sector or the traditional sector to the manufacturing sector. This really hasn't happened in the Indian economy. So this is really tragic, and this is a million-dollar question. We need to definitely answer these things more systematically. But that result is quite visible in the paper. And on top of that, it is quite interesting that agriculture still has contributed significantly. I mean, not only in terms of growth, but also in terms of productivity growth. And apart from the service sector, and agriculture has contributed. And to be honest, in agriculture, particularly in Indian economy, is largely undertaken by the informal sector. And so this sector has contributed. Now, within the service sector, the paper has also highlighted that non-market sectors has actually contributed a lot. I mean, this is quite interesting. I don't know whether that kind of categorization has been explicitly highlighted any other paper, but I think this is quite interesting, I would say. Now, as such, I don't want to contest any of the results or hypotheses that has been highlighted in the paper, but I'd like to say something on that, to contribute in the discussions on why, let's say, the productivity growth hasn't shoot up, in spite of the fact that there has been significant policy changes has happened in Indian economy, and Abdul has listed many of those. Um, um, so even then that hasn't happened. I mean, we need to actually uh, unfold the puzzle to some extent. And in this respect, I would like to make one or two comments for your thoughts, and maybe for wider discussion later on. One thing that I mean, when Abdul had given a comparison between India and China. Now, of course, the capital accumulation has contributed much to China's growth. Indian economy, the capital accumulation, let's say, investment to GDP ratio has moved up, then again it has declined. And within this, Abdul has also shown the capital accumulation has largely done by the private sector. So the contribution of the public sector has declined. Now, there has been really the puzzle. I mean, that has to be to certain until. I mean, I'm just sharing my thought for your consideration. Now, let's say from 90 onwards, liberalization measure has been taken. So the government has tried to withdraw its investment on various other sectors. Basically, the sectors where the public services are being provided, mainly those sectors. Now, those sectors are supposed to be considered as non-market sectors. Now, and within the service category, so those sectors are now taken over by the private entities. Now, let's say various kind of, let's say if you took at non-public sectors, you can take school, restaurant, various kind of services, banking, um, health sectors. These are the sector that comes under non-market sectors. Now, and those sectors has huge demand in the domestic economy. I mean, and those sectors are not largely being exploited. I mean, these are basically non-traded sectors, I would say. And when let's say those sectors which were held by, let's say, public sector, when public sectors were unable to deliver efficiently in the previous regimes, and those sectors has been taken over by the private sectors. And if you just see, these are the sectors that place some kind of these are not really the sectors where, let's say, Cobb Douglas production Pakistan is supposed to be working. Why I'm saying that? Because they actually appear as a allied sectors, which is helping public sector to private investment or the overall productions to grow. So, or rather, I would say that these actually play a factor contributing to the creating the externality in the systems. Or if you create a productivity and some part of productivity that is sourced from the externality, and those non-market sectors, let's say, they actually play some kind of externality, and those sectors are largely being privatized, and that has gone to the private. Now, so when that has happened, of course, now let's say liberalization onwards, what has happened? Two main things has happened. One, that uh, public sector disinvestment has taken place, and those disinvestment has been taken over by the private sector. Second thing that has happened, trade barriers has been withdrawn. So that means we are assumed to really say that our export market should actually expand, and that can actually play some role. And so that means the sector where we have comparative advantage, those sectors are supposed to really grow. But now look at that, where do we have comparative advantage? Comparative advantage we had on the agriculture or also traditional sector, because these are more labor intensive sectors, and those labor intensive sectors are largely are on the hands of informal sector, and that's the reason we are unable to really get benefit from the export market to a large extent from those sectors. And so rather you see, if you look at also the export basket of Indian economy, many of those are from the capital intensive sectors. So let's say, so that's also the reason why the trade itself actually did not actually give much boost to the larger industrial sectors in the economy. On the other, so trade can, what else do? Trade can also bring some kind of competitiveness in the economy. Now, in place of competitiveness, so when let's say trade has created, as per let's say the Krugman framework, we know that when the competition go up, then the price is supposed to go down, and that's why you would be more competitive to the increase your exports. But that hasn't also happened. If you look at also recent informations, and including some of my research and some colleagues that has also done some work, then the monopolization rather, particularly the sector, exportable sectors, has an increase. So what does it mean? That instead of the fact that the trade, which is supposed to depress the product price, rather given some kind of additional markup. So that markup has actually done some kind of consolidation in the investment. So this is the problem that has actually happened in Indian economy. So and now in the face of competitions, what has also happened in Indian economy, the formal sector who is producing much of their good in order to be competitive, instead of not producing in the R&D sector, Abdul has already mentioned that the R&D investment is relatively low. Instead of increasing R&D in Indian industry, I mean, mainly formal sectors, what those industry has done, they tried to outsource more to the informal sector. Now, when you are trying to more to the informal sector, so that has helped to do this. One thing that your labor rigidity has actually declined, because if you are producing more with the help of informal sector, labor cannot be so rigid. In spite of the fact that you have huge labor revolution supports in the formal sector, but you can actually economize the production function. So in the surplus that can, so that if you, instead of producing with the help of union worker, which is much more costly, and if you're producing with the informal sector, that could be definitely less costly. So that's why you would be more competitive in the international market. That's the reason how you have actually increased your export market to some extent, but that hasn't actually increased your productivity in the economy. And that hasn't also increased your R&D investment in the economy. So this is really the problem. That's the also reason, except for few industrial sector which has been exportable last, let's say, 2 or 3 decades, we couldn't actually increase our market per export basket. And so that's the reason productivity has actually growth has been driven by non-market sector, which is interestingly has come up from Abdul papers, and that is simply because of those sectors has huge domestic demand, and their return has actually gone up. So I will make one more point, and then I will end up. Now, although we know that in order to increase the productivity, investment is required, which is definitely key. But investment, physical investment, let's say K by L, doesn't contribute to the productivity. And we know all the solo growth model. Solo growth model simply said that simply if you increase investment, that doesn't necessarily contribute to the growth rate. We have all of but the investment in the associate factor, second factor. I mean, if you just consider the two sector model, like where investment is also taking place on other sector like say health, education, those sectors actually create externality. Now, Abdul has also mentioned that the investment on sector, let's say education, by public sector hasn't actually grown up much in terms of GDP, at least you can say. So that's the reason for the externality. I mean, this is by the reform itself is also designed to privatize some of the service sectors. So that's the reason why investment in the education hasn't actually gone up. So that's the reason. Whereas in China, some of those investment which has actually gone to the non-market sector has actually made a favorable impact in the manufacturing activities, which hasn't happened in Indian economy. So this is one of the problem I would say. So in order to definitely increase productivity growth or growth, let's say achieve, let's say greasy in economy, we need definitely investment, but the composition of investment would actually matter if you want to really increase the productivity growth as such. So last one I'd like to make. Um, See, now we have said that previously, let's say before liberalization, before 1990s, much of the public sector investment was there to creating, let's say, large scale industry and others definitely is fine. But on top of that, all those non-market activities were also being catered by public sectors. So this has been reduced by design of the policies. Now, and one of the major problem was that public sector has been inefficient because of the bureaucracy and red tape regime Abdul has mentioned. And now the thing is that we have changed. I mean, there has been technological revolution has taken place, particularly in the IT, AI, and others. Now some of the sector, let's say, if you can use, let's say, IT instrument or the AI instrument, then you can easily identify who has done what kind of work. So that contribution, individual contribution in the productivity can always be measured. Previous problem was that in a public sector, when 10 workers are working, I mean, it is really difficult for us to identify who has contributed how much. But with the use of, let's say, if you can put a CCTV camera in a one single room, who has actually done how much work can easily be measured. Now, if that is done, then what is important now? It is important that how can we really give an incentive to the individual who is putting their best effort and punish those person who are not putting the effort. That distinction is important. That reform is important. In a democratic country like us, is really challenging, to be honest. I don't know how that could be done. If that can be done, I think the productivity can be. And then I'm telling specifically when the climate change actually damaging productivity, 1 degree temperature rise is going to reduce your labor productivity. There has been a number of estimates, and then in that case, to reduce your carbon emission in the economy, then at least in some of the core sector where public sector won't actually care whether they are emitting or not, then public sector involvement in some of the sector is needed. Otherwise, we won't be able to reduce carbon emission. And then if it is needed, then I think that kind of IT or the AI related implication where productivity, individual productivity can be easily identified and segregate and pay according to the productivity, and so that the incentive could be aligned to the good doer, then the productivity would win. And this is quite challenge. And if you could do, definitely, I think we can achieve the Viksit Bharat. So with that, I'd like to stop here.
Thank you so much, Dibyendu. Now I request Dr. Veena to please read out what Dr. Mitra has shared with us, because he could not come at the last moment.
Thank you.
Veena, you're here?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mahua, and also Dr. Aramban for the excellent presentation. I'll just read out what Professor Arup Mitra has shared. The first point is the total factor productivity concept is highly misleading. Therefore, only TFPG appears to be meaningful. The association between TFPG and labor productivity needs to be examined. If there exists a strong correlation between the two, the gains from productivity are discernible. However, in the face of a weak relationship between the two, it would mean that labor productivity growth is due to capital accumulation, while the gains from TFPG are negligible. Secondly, the intangible capital cost needs to be considered while measuring TFPG. After accounting for the intangible capital cost, it may be observed that TFPG is actually negligible. In fact, while relating productivity with the trade policy, it is important that TFPG is calculated after taking into consideration the intangible capital cost. Along with the trade policy, the location policy needs to be considered in the context of productivity growth. The right type of location policy contributes significantly to productivity growth. Provision for on-the-job training and training for contractual and casual workers at the ground level are instrumental in productivity growth. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Veena. Iramban, you want to respond to any of the discussions?
Yeah, of course. I will not
please.
go to detailed answers, but I will start with the Beyandu, because great comments as usual, the Beyandu. But it looks like the Beyandu's final point is that police to improve productivity, right? So that is something which is something which is debatable. Of course, I'm not sure if I completely would buy that. But all other points which the Beyandu has made are well taken, and especially one point I would make is that within the non-market services, what we found is that some of the sectors which are also traded sectors, like telecom, finance, and business services, which also include computer services, are relatively better performing sectors compared to other non-market service economies. So, but regardless of that, I completely agree with you that one reason why I treat non-market services separately in my whole study, I mean, I also, Suresh also know that I always insist on, whenever we do these productivity comparisons, is that these non-market services are not typically following the standard, market economy principle. So it does not really make much sense to look into their productivity dynamics. So regardless of that, I completely agree with you that their improvement creates some kind of spillover effect on other sectors of the economy in terms of productivity. And other points which you made, I think I don't need to respond to them, but I think I take all of them very good points, and perhaps we should discuss further on this too. I mean, I see a lot of opportunities there to go further on that aspects. Now, let me come to Arup's points. I think I already look into that decomposition of LP, lower productivity, into TOPG versus other things. So I'm keeping that aside. But I wanted to reinforce and agree with Arup on the importance of intangible investment. I am currently finished. Actually, we just finished a paper with some World Bank colleagues on understanding the impact of intangible investment on labor income share in Indian economy. So whether investment in intangible is actually stimulating or reducing labor income through channel through improvement in productivity, and we find very interesting results there. So definitely intangible is something which we need to take into account, but we don't have much data on that. Now, last but not least, but very good comments by Rijesh. And let me, of course, the identification question, Rajesh, of course, let's do that if you are interested. It's a big question. Of course, it is something which I did not try to do that here. Now, about the political economy of the policy regime, initially I had such discussions in the paper, but I think the reviewers have, also because of that space, I think we had to take it off. But every policy, not every policy, many policies in India had a context, many of them. So that is very important to understand that context. Now, I'm not completely sure if I fully agree with your point that I agree with your point that the pro and anti categorization may be oversimplifying, but however, I'm not completely sure that in the ISI kind of policies have helped us. I mean, what your point is that it creates opportunity to specialize, and specialization is improving by for protecting your industry and so on. But in a longer term perspective, if that industry does not have comparative advantage and it does not develop further comparative advantage, it may not be successful. And how many industries we protected in the pre-1980s have succeeded in the international or national market, except maybe pharmaceutical industry, right? So do we have any other successful stories that we could clearly say that, I mean, we have been excelling in productivity? I mean, all our policies were targeted towards manufacturing, but we failed in industrializing the Indian economy. So, of course, we can discuss it further, but I'm not completely sure about that is the case. Now, the channel to productivity improvement, that I completely agree with that point. Let me see if I have anything else that I really want to comment on. So the importance of R&D, yeah, I fully agree with that point. I mean, I also acknowledge that point of the R&D investment here. Yeah, I think that's it, right? So I think these are great comments, and I really take those comments with me. Thank you very much for those comments, and let's see if we have any other questions from the audience.
The floor is open for questions. Only 5 minutes are left. If someone wants to ask Anamam, please go ahead.
Let Suresh say something. Suresh, is he there?
Yes, yes.
I hope you can hear me.
Yeah,
Yes, sir. Yes.
we wanted to hear
Much
you.
to add some of what Abdul has presented. We have done joint work, as he has also acknowledged, and the story is quite familiar. But I think what is new in this paper for me and for many others is how he has been able to compartmentalize different policies into different categories in terms of trade, R&D, and the importance of these policies and linking these policies to different phases of TFP, I think is a great learning. And I'm sure it will be a good learning for all the students and
Of
even for
course.
researchers like me. And as far as the comments are concerned, I also agree with some of the comments. And as Abdul has said, perhaps there is some data limitation also. It is not always possible to acknowledge all these factors like ICT capital and non-ICT capital. I think we have been struggling a lot to find out the contribution of these factors in TFP. And in a recent paper, we did try to look into the impact of ICT in the informal sector, because some information is now available in the latest rounds of ASUSC. So, and I'm sure with the availability of more data, perhaps some of these questions related to the role of IT, role of R&D, and role of non-ICT capital perhaps would be explored, and we will have a better picture in future. But thanks to Abdul for giving us this overview of the policy regimes. And I really enjoyed this presentation. And I
Thank you,
hope
Suresh.
to look forward to work on these areas in future with him and with other researchers. Thank you. And thank you, Rijesh. I enjoyed your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Suresh.
Sure.
Just point to add to that, because many of you may already know that, right? Because the Intan Invest and the World Intellectual Property Organization have done some basic estimates of intangible investment in India at the aggregate level at the economy. I mean, I have been working with them in terms of as an external advisor kind of role. But of course, they have to make a lot of assumptions about the labor market and so on to make that number actually. But it is a very challenging exercise to see if we
Abdul,
can
what
get
is the
those
period
kind.
of this study?
Which study?
This data which you are
Intangible.
saying, how long it is available?
I think it's for last 5 years or so. It's not very long.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it was a big news in India, actually. I think it was in the most media covered it. And then I was quite surprised because the intangible investment to GDP in India was much higher than China or Japan or Germany, according to the estimate. Then I went back to them and asked them. Then they said that the India really wanted it to be a highlightable number. So they have removed the informal sector GDP somehow from the denominator and then calculated, estimated intangible to formal sector GDP or something to get the very high ratio.
Mohua, I mean, if you have 1 minute, can I say one thing?
Please.
So, I mean, Abdul did not actually mean that, but when we also consider the productivity growth and estimate, now the output which is marketed is being considered. Usually, what we say that productivity is actually synonymized in terms of the technological changes which actually increase your frontier of production function or something. That's the reason why it is. But even if let's say frontier goes up, until and unless this output is marketed or sold or either exported or brought by someone, that is not reflected. So let's say your technology can increase output definitely, but it has to be marketed. That's the reason why productivity estimation is also done in terms of the market equilibrium. So the Ramsey model, that side is quite important. Now, why I'm saying that? Because in Indian economy from 90 onward, another thing that has also happened, inequality has increased. At least the income of the 50%, lower 50% peoples, that their growth almost negligible. At least the recent estimates have been telling that. And if their estimate, let's say majority of the people, their income hasn't grown much, so that means their purchasing power hasn't actually gone up. So that's why even if your technology which enable you to increase your output cannot be market until and unless you increase your export base. And export, particularly from after financial crisis, has been challenging. So that's the reason why until and unless your market base, let's say 50% people hasn't gone up, then your productivity growth is also going to be arrested. So the demand side approach to some extent somehow to be also brought in somehow in the discussion. That is all. That's all.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's an explanatory factor. I mean, the demand side explanation, because if you don't have market, I mean, in a way, it's a kind of reciprocal, right? Because if you have bigger market and then the potential for production also goes up, that would improve productivity. But right now, maybe 20% of the population are above upper middle class, and then that is creating the bigger demand for some of these big high value added products. Which might be driving productivity while the rest is not. So I think it's a good point. Well taken. I completely agree with you.
Mahua, can I come in? I'm Danish Hashim.
Please, Danish.
Yeah. Hi, Abdul. Good to listen to you again after a long time. So, a very nice and comprehensive presentation. And what actually came out, and that's something people have been actually talking about, why we are not able to actually go beyond 1% of productivity growth, despite all the reform that you mentioned right from 1950s. The 90s, we unleashed so much of reforms, and then we continue to do reforms or undertake reforms, even deregulation exercise and all that. But the bottom line is that our contribution of productivity growth to GDP growth or output growth, that continues to remain utterly poor. In fact, hello, am I audible?
Yes.
So that went up to the extent of, if I talk about manufacturing and what you call factory sector, so it contributed the best during 2002 and maybe say 11-12, and then it has again come down. So just two or three factors I would like to point out. One is that some people may say it is a mostly demand side phenomena. I do not agree with that. If you have, say, your manufacturing export as a percentage of global exports, you find very clear decline in this share right from 2013. I mean, it's a open this thing. You can go and check the data. So it is definitely not a demand side phenomena. It is a supply side phenomena. And supply side phenomena, when you talk about, it actually relates to competitiveness at the end of the day. So even when you have certain policies implementation, you mentioned about GST, you mentioned about what you call IBC, a host of other policy reforms, even say Jan Vishwas Act or say I can even mention about Mediation Act or Commercial Disputes Act. So many acts have been implemented. But at the end of the day, whether that is resulting in unleashing of productivity growth, so here you actually come down to the point of what is called as implementation of the reforms. So, like for example, despite the implementation of IBC, you still find that in hardly in any cases you are taking cases are getting resolved in a stipulated time. Similarly, if you talk about judicial reforms, it remains. Still it may take 10 years, 20 years. No one knows. Whereas you have such a powerful commercial act. If you implement it, much of the problem will be solved. And the third point, like for example, GVC integration. You are expert of GVC as well. Like for example, in the recent past or maybe since early 2010, you would see that there is a restriction in availability of material resources. And so that has an impact on your competitiveness, and that again has effect on your export this thing. So that also needs to be factored in, because you cannot actually talk about productivity or unleashing productivity growth without taking into account your what you call GVC integration. And last point, very well said, and I really like that point, and I fully agree with you that capital deepening is at most important if we actually want to increase or think about increasing the productivity growth. But unfortunately, that is not happening. And why and how that happen? That remains the critical point. Capital accumulation is not something just you make some broad changes here and there and it will start happening. That's the story we have seen in the 90s. We go on doing reforms and all that, and if you see capital labor ratio, you yourself have indicated that capital labor ratio is not increasing at a pace where we had actually expected this to happen. So long way to go. Like for example, I would say we have not even begun the journey of unleashing productivity reform, but I think there's a lot that needs to be done. Your point on R&D, bang on true, 0.6% is definitely not good enough. We must take it to 2% at that year, but that itself will not take care of. So demand side, coming back to the point, demand side is not the actually factor. If you have competitiveness, you can actually take care of demand. So right now it is the supply side problem and the competitiveness that is the most critical point. So this is what I just wanted to mention. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I will just briefly respond to Hashim. First of all, thank you very much for this comment, Hashim. But I think the demand side point, which Debendu earlier said, is most of a domestic economy issue is also contributing to that's a point. But the other points which you said are part of the institutional or foundational policy part that I discuss in the paper. Actually, I did not present it today, but I do discuss that. And an important problem for India is that there is a gap in the implementation of policies, and the second is an effectiveness of some of the policies being implemented. So those two factors also I briefly talk about. Sorry. And the third point which you mentioned is the GVC integration point. Well taken. I also discussed that actually briefly in the paper. Interesting point is that India still rely heavily a lot on if you look at the India's GVC participation, the reliance on Chinese inputs, for example, and so on. So there is the both backward and forward participation in the global value chain and how that is contributing to productivity. And that aspect also need to be definitely taken into account. Completely agree with those points. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Any other? We can have 2-3 minutes more. If anyone wants to ask them anything.
Yeah, Aziz, I was just, if you give me 1 minute.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
Please.
Rajesh, yes, I do.
Yeah, I was thinking whether we can interpret this productivity trajectory in terms of a large scale kind of creative destruction. Is it possible to have that kind of interpretation where, like pre-liberalization, we had created certain, although there have been inefficiencies and all, we have tried to build certain technological and institutional capabilities, for example, scientific institutions, engineering, education, and all. And then after the liberalization, we try to employ them into more competitive sectors. So, is it a kind of a creative, in a large scale creative destruction kind of thing? Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, so the creative destruction story also I discuss in the paper briefly, especially in the context of the 1980s when we had all those licensing relaxation, broadbanding, and opening up, and all those kind of things, which immediately provided opportunities to private entrants. And as the Bendu earlier said, especially for example in sectors like electronics and textiles and so on, as the Bendu earlier said, for example, many of those activities which were earlier done by inefficiently and ineffectively done by the public sector to private sector, that already creates some creative destruction in the sense that it is of course destroying what has been there in a way, but at the same time it is opening up new opportunities and challenges for private sector firms to get into the system and compete with the state-owned enterprises in the production and gain efficiency. So there are many ways through which these kind of policies will effectively. So also, I mean, some of the disinvestment of unprofitable and unproductive sectors, and then moving that into private sector. All those things could be considered as creative destruction in this whole regime. Even when you opened up import of capital goods, before that we were relying on outmoded machines, for example, right? I mean, then you open up your import of capital goods, which helps firms to replace their old technology with a new one, which is also creative destruction. So that makes the obsolescence rate of your existing capital faster and replacement rate higher, right? So all this can contribute to improvement in productivity. Of course, you can see that, but in such a long frame of time period and different policy regimes, I'm really not sure how one can really conceive that idea and put that into practically, in a measurable factor of creative destruction. I mean, I myself did a paper on creative destruction in using the data of Dutch firm level data on how firms are buying capital and discarding capital, and whether that is actually related to creative destruction kind of thing. So where we found very strong evidence of creative destruction in the manufacturing sector in the Netherlands, for example. So
But
it is
Abdul,
possible.
sorry,
Yeah.
can we have examples of aviation or banking or telecommunication in India where I think the public sector has been almost completely replaced or outdated by the private sector? Can these be examples of creative destruction?
Yeah, that could be. I mean, if we can show that actually improved the efficiency of that sector, banking sector, perhaps. I mean, we did not completely abandon public sector banks, but definitely we have, when we open banking sector to the private sector, we all would agree that it has improved the efficiency and competitiveness of even the public sector enterprises, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure there must be studies about it. Airline industry, I don't know if there are studies about it, but again, we all know how inefficient the public sector airlines were, and I don't know how efficient it is in the private sector. But definitely, yes, these are nice examples to look into.
Thank you so much. I think we are running out of time. I want to end the discussion here. And many thanks to Aramban for your excellent presentation, as always expected from you. And we all enjoyed very much. And we look forward more to such good work from you and share with us. With these words, I congratulate everybody to make, in spite of busy schedule, to make it here and enjoy Abdul's presentation. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Thank you, Dibendu, Rajesh, and Aruba again for all the great comments.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you
Thank you.
all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.